Good afternoon and welcome to today's Link Senior webinar. Just a few housekeeping items before we begin today. For those of you who would like to have NAV and NCAP CEU credit, you must stay on the webinar for the full hour. At the end of the webinar, I will be providing the required post-webinar survey evaluation link in the chat box in the webinar room and by a constant contact email message. You must fill out the survey no later than midnight this Sunday, November 18th, to be eligible for CEU credit. Certificates will be sent this Monday. If you are not looking for CEU credit, please do fill out the survey as we would like your feedback as well. So Link Senior has been providing these informational webinars since the beginning of this year, and so far we've had more than 2,000 participants. This is a look at some of our past speakers from the field, as well as a quote from a webinar participant. And we'd like to ask that if you have an idea for future speakers as we put together our list for 2019, please do use the email address on the slide to share your thoughts and ideas with us directly. Link Senior currently has more than 300 clients in the United States and Canada, and this is just a snapshot of some of our partners and supporters. We recently went to the Point Click Care Summit in Nashville to share results from our Center for Aging and Brain Health Innovation Research, which we've been conducting over the last year with Responsive Health Management in Toronto. This is a look at some of the initial findings from that research. Today, we are thrilled to have Vicki de Klerk-Rubin, the Executive Director of the Validation Training Institute, with us. And this is a look at today's agenda and objectives, and we'll be reserving time at the end of the webinar for your questions. You can post those directly into the chat box in the webinar room. Vicki is a certified validation master who began teaching in 1989. Her book, Validation Techniques for Dementia Care, The Family Guide to Improving Communication, has been published in multiple languages. We're very excited to have Vicki with us today. Before Vicki starts her presentation, Charles D. Vilmorin, the CEO of Link Senior, is with us and will now provide a brief introduction before turning it over to Vicki.
Thank you very much, Megan. And I personally wanted to thank Vicki for joining us today and share some of her most valuable information about validation. We're excited to have her. We're excited to be hosting these webinars, as Megan was saying. And what I wanted to do is give a brief description of today's presentation and then share a little bit for the need for more resident engagement. So validation is actually, if not one of the most proven methods to help us communicate with older adults that we serve in our communities and outside, whether it's somebody living with some kind of mild cognitive impairment or a diagnosis of dementia. The typical aging process is greatly enhanced when a caregiver has a knowledge or has been trained in the validation method. So with that, I'd like to give a little bit of kind of background and from a overall market perspective, go through, where are we in terms of resident engagement and where are there opportunities, where are opportunities to grow there. We always love to start with that quote that some people that have participated in these webinars might have seen before, which is that every person is a person based on who they are, what they like, what are their preferences, and really most importantly, sometimes what supports their purpose. Right? You might be familiar with the work of Abraham Maslow with the pyramid of needs, but there is this inherent idea that throughout the lifespan until the very last day, hours of seconds of someone's life, that a person is always trying to be who they must be. And in the context of somebody living with dementia, as a caregiver, we need to understand what that means, and we need to understand what are the barriers so we can help that person, in our case, our resident, be who they must be. There is a very clinical definition of what engagement is, which is to occupy someone or have them involved in an external stimulus. This definition is great from a clinical standpoint, but sadly removes this idea of purpose. So we like to take that definition and augment it with the idea that we all need somebody to be who we must be. And often that missing link is resident engagement, that idea of activities, life enrichment, rec therapy or wellness, or the psychosocial needs of someone. Our task in the senior care industry, whether we work in IL, assisted living, memory care, or nursing home environment, by definition is very, very challenging. As an industry, we don't staff much, right? We know that our residents are highly dependent on us because of their cognitive journey, where they are, and just the typical aging process. Sadly, the family doesn't visit much. This is a statistic from the CMS for nursing homes. We don't really have that stat for assisted living, but the idea is that if the family doesn't visit much, the resident needs the staff to stay engaged and commit and stay who they are and who they must be again. Something we often forget is there is a big focus on antipsychotic medication in the industry, but we forget that these medications often is a barrier, a challenge in helping us, in having us engage the residents more in a more person-centered way. Whether it's antipsychotics, but also antidepressants or any type of medication, these medications often are an additional barrier. The result of all of that is a pretty scary statistics for the ones that don't know it already, is that a typical resident in senior care today only receives 11 minutes of activities a day. So the idea is that if these people can't self-recreate anymore, that standard is pretty low. And so the idea is, how can we do more, right? It's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity in what we do in our field of resident engagement. And it's important to understand what it is that we do and how we are trying to do it. And so if I'm a staff person engaging the older adult, I want to get to know them. Beyond that, in the context of validation, I want to know who they are, what is their life been, what are some of their challenges, and sometimes how can I help that person with unmet needs. That would then inform a plan, help me or help my team engage the residents and evaluate that. And I think it's important to understand this process as an ongoing process for every and all of our residents, because then we can help meet the needs and support that purpose. There's a very well-established framework, the concept of wellness, which was highly pushed by the World Health Organization. The good thing is that the whole senior care industry has slowly but surely embraced that idea. But it's important to recognize the idea of a holistic approach to an individual. You know, the sad standard of activities that somewhat still exists today a little bit is the 3 Bs, right? Bingo, Bible, and birthday. And so we must commit as an organization, we must commit as resident engagement professional to make sure that we engage every single resident, not only based on who they are and what the data from the care plan means, but also what can help them support that purpose. I actually personally went through the training of a validation worker, and so like you, I am familiar with this idea of the pyramid of needs of Maslow. One of the most profound work of Naomi Feil and the Validation Training Institute is to actually advance that field and advance some of the basic frameworks of person-centered care. For example, that pyramid of need was adapted to the field of dementia to take into account basic unique needs of residents and draw parallel and actually reworded some of these frameworks. I'd like to share my personal experience as a validation validation worker, and then transition to Vicky. For me, as you might know, some of you might know, I'm personally passionate and have dedicated my career to advancing the engagement of the older adult. Becoming a validation worker is actually one of the biggest achievements I've done to support my experience in the field of dementia care. It has provided me with credibility as a professional, but it's really helped me understand the older adult that we serve. It helps me communicate and care with compassion and actually be more effective. I went through the internet-based course, which was highly flexible. It was well adapted to the fact that I do have a full-time job as the CEO and co-founder of Link Senior, and the educational content was extremely well delivered. With that, I have the extreme honor to provide a transition to Vicky Leclerc-Rubin, and she will be talking to us about how we can break through dementia for our residents using validation. Thank you, Vicky.
Oh, thank you for such a wonderful introduction. Hi, everybody. I am talking to you from Germany, which is appropriate because that is where Naomi Feil came from. She left Germany in 1937 as a 4-year-old child, and her family moved to Cleveland, Ohio. The next slide, please. To a place called the Montefiore Home for the Elderly. And they lived in 5 rooms in this nursing home. So as a young child, my mother grew up with these people. She gained so much insight into what makes them tick. And I think with that unique background really helped her creatively break through what had been taught up until that point. And we're talking now the 50s, 60s, and 70s, which is where she first started working with validation. Her first book was written in 1982. Where the ideas and the theory and the techniques started to come together as a method. One of the things that my mom always says, and I don't know if I told you, but Naomi Feil is my mother, and that's how I got into this work. She asked me to please help her revise her books, which I did. And I thought I was all smart, having learned everything in her book. And the first time I was asked to speak about validation, and now we're talking 1988, a very experienced nurse asked me a question, and I had to run back to the book to look it up. And that's where I realized truly it takes practice. It takes correction and redoing and time and working with the residents, because it's the residents who really inform us through their wisdom what's the right way to go. At this point, many, many years later, Validation Training Institute has, actually, the slide is a little old. It's now up to 23 training centers in Beijing, in Japan, all over Europe, and all over the United States. These training centers offer a variety of ways of learning validation skills. And we have over 380 certified validation teachers all over the world. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. Next slide, please. I'll tell you very quickly what is validation and how you can explain it to somebody tomorrow or later today. Validation has a basic attitude that's based on honesty and integrity, of course. You could call it an empathetic approach to every human being, including older people with and without cognitive decline. This attitude is only the prerequisites to using validation. There are techniques, verbal techniques, nonverbal techniques, and they're wonderful and collected from many different sources. And the techniques don't work unless you apply this basic attitude. And you can use the techniques with the basic attitude, but if you do it for the wrong reason, in other words, without the theory, without the principles, the goals, and understanding why I do validation, it doesn't work very well. So it's really a triangle that each element is interdependent on the other. Our training combines a lot of work in the basic attitude and certainly a lot of work in the techniques, but the total integration of the principles. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the principles, not in a technical way. Next slide, please. One of the most important and difficult of the principles is don't try to change older adults, especially if they have cognitive decline. They can't change. We have to enter into their world. And I'll tell you a story. It's about my stepfather, who has cognitive decline, and he lives in his own world, what we call a personal reality, or you could call it time confusion. But in any case, he was at my house and he was sleeping in his room. And my job was to get him up and dressed and out. And I knocked on the door and he was in a very sour mood and he didn't want to do anything. And I'd say, come on, let's get going. And he fighting me on it. And that went on, this struggle for many days. And I'm trained in this method. Finally, I just said, what am I doing? And the next time I tried it, I knocked on the door, I opened it, I said, good morning. And he went, what do you want? And I said, good morning, we've talked the whole night through. And I continued on with my song. And his eyes lit up. And he said, hey, Singing in the Rain. And I said, exactly, Debbie Reynolds. And then we were off and running. We had built the relationship or rebuilt the relationship in that moment, connected, and then we could move on. So I think that's a good example of you can't change them. You can only enter into their world. And through that, perhaps, accomplish what we want to accomplish, whether it's a family member or whether it's a resident. Next slide, please. Yeah, listening with empathy. We all think we do that, but very often we don't. And sometimes it's projection, and sometimes it's scary. There was a lady I was working with in a nursing home, and every time she would talk about her home, which of course had long been sold or given up, she would get so worked up, it looked like she was having an epileptic seizure. And one time I decided to just see where that went. I did not bring up her house. She brought up the topic. And I just said, what happened with the house? And she was expressing and went into this sort of, and her eyes rolled back. And I just breathed with her. I used the validation technique mirroring. And I also was saying the emotion that I felt that she was expressing. And after very few minutes, because she couldn't keep that going very long, her breathing slowed, my breathing slowed. I said, how are you? And she said, I'm better now. I said, what would you like? And she said, I think I need a little rest. I said, I bet you do. That was a lot to go through. And then she felt better and lighter. And she had a little cup of tea, and then she took a nap. that built our relationship. I stuck in there with her. And we were able to communicate a lot in the coming weeks and months that I was there. Next slide, please. There is a reason behind the behavior. This is a core belief in validation. It's not for every demented person, but it's for the very old person who has usually the diagnosis of late onset Alzheimer. There was a lady I was working with, her name was Mrs. Weber, and she was not speaking. She hadn't spoken in 6 months or longer. And she would walk around the nursing home, very heavy, collecting items, putting them in her dress pockets, napkins, spoons, toilet paper, pens, anything she could hang on to, she would put them in her dress. And that behavior seems very strange until you discover that Mrs. Weber was a young mother with 2 small children in war-torn Rotterdam. Rotterdam was bombed flat. And you can imagine that in her mind's eye, she was trying to complete her identity, to be useful, to care for her children, and was still stuck in that moment. That was a moment that kept replaying for her. Mrs. Weber also was found underneath the dining room table every time there was a storm with thunder and lightning. And of course, that makes sense when you learn her history. Let's go on to the next one. I've got a million stories, but I'll tell you another time. What can you do? People want to do something. And I understand that because people go into this kind of work for a very good reason. You want to connect with older people. You want to make their lives better in this final stage of life. And the most important thing that you can do is to not lie to them, not try to change them by diverting and saying, oh, we'll find your mother later, let's have a cup of tea, and certainly not confronting them with reality orientation. Those methods are hard and they're not effective in the long run. Validation helps you enter into their world. And there are some very specific steps you can take, like observe. What do I see? What do I hear? What do I feel? And when you observe that, then you calibrate. And by calibrate, I mean to change your face, your eyes, your breathing, your tone of voice to match what you see. And when you can do that, very often empathy comes up. And by empathy and validation, we're talking about we're feeling the emotions that we sense coming out of the other person. Next slide, please. That all sounds so easy, right? Because we all have busy lives, and sometimes it's really hard to quiet the thoughts and the feelings that are going on, which are very real, and you have every right to your thoughts and feelings. But sometimes they can really get in the way of connecting with another human being, whether they're old or young or anyone. So I want to do a little exercise with you right now. And if you would please put your feet on the ground so that you can feel the ground underneath you. And you can close your eyes. I will close my eyes. And try to relax your shoulders a bit and your neck a bit. Maybe wiggle your tush in the seat. And breathe in through your nose and out of your mouth. And think of a color that gives you energy, a color that makes you feel resourceful, perhaps. And imagine this color in the air around your head, so that every time you inhale through your nose, you're breathing in this color into your body. And when you exhale, the color floats through your body like air in a balloon. So inhale again. Bring the color into your body. Exhale. Send the color down through your torso. Fill your legs with color. Fill your feet and your toes. Now imagine that with the next breath, your arms fill with color, all the way to the wrists. Use another breath to fill your hands and your fingertips with color. The energy tingles. You have the resources. And with one last great big breath, fill your head with color. And when you're ready, open your eyes. And come on back to the here and now. So I hope that was useful for you. It's one of many, many centering exercises that we do in classes. Maybe you already have a way to center yourself, to clear your mind of thoughts and feelings. And that's great. If you have it, use it, because this technique is the most important of everything we teach. Because if you're filled with your thoughts and feelings, you can't be open to another human being, whether that be your child, your husband, your best friend, or a resident in a facility. There's one more technique I want to talk to you about. Next slide. Yes. And that has to do with how we use our voice tone. For those of you who work in facilities, you might have heard the following voice tone. Now, Mrs. de Klerk, I think it's time for you to go to the toilet. Shall we go together? And that kind of voice tone is not respectful. It's not adult to adult. It can be controlling, and it can call up a lot of angry feelings. Or alternatively, it can shut people down. So you want to try to talk to people as if they were like your best friend, like any other adult who you respect. Use an adult to adult voice tone. And the other thing to be aware of in your voice tone is your body and your voice need to match. What you say is less important than your physical, as you can see from this slide. Next slide, please. People are expressing, as Charles so beautifully put it, basic human needs, which include emotions, anger, frustration, love, happiness, sadness. They have old traumas that often, because they've been pushed down over so many years, 50, 60 years, ignoring a war experience, the loss of a child, anger at being put down by parents. All that stuff can finally come out in old age. It bubbles up. Naomi uses the image of a champagne cork popping up and coming out. And all those emotions finally get expressed. And what we can do to help is to listen, to be there with them. We can't change it. We can't make it better. We can't bring back a husband who has died. But what we can do is be there as the person expresses the emotion or the need. Next slide, please. We accompany them. And we do that by exploring, asking questions if the person is verbal, or using nonverbal techniques if that person is only expressing their emotions and needs nonverbally. And we can do that. We believe validation theory says that people are in the process of resolving unfinished issues until they die. And our job is to accompany them in that process. Next slide, please. These are things that validation has offered me personally. I communicate so much better now that I've learned validation. I choose my words better. I project less. I have much better perspective on not just older people, but myself as well and my surrounding circle. Validation has helped me gain more self-reflection. I see myself differently, and I see my aging process differently. It's improved my relationships, both personally, but absolutely in the work that I do. And the other wonderful thing about it is when I enter into a facility, a nursing home, memory care, whatever, I feel competent. I feel like I know what I can do. Even if somebody comes up going, ah, and yelling at me, I don't get scared. I have skills. I can handle it. And that's a wonderful feeling. Next slide, please. This very short presentation is the tip of the iceberg. And we've got 4 certification levels in validation. They all are developed out of years of experience teaching, honing our programs, our curricula, making them better and better. Each one has testing at the end, and all the curricula, the authorizations, the certifications are worldwide. We have quality standards that we hang on to, and they really, I think, create security for the participant as well as the user. Validation worker, you learn how to individually validate older adults. Level 2 is doing groups of 4 to 8 disoriented older adults, and that can be a total blast. And it can be an integral part of a person-centered facility. Level 3 is learning how to present validation and becoming a validation teacher. And level 4 is validation master, after you've been a validation teacher for about 5 years. Validation is not a static thing. It's not the same as it was 40 years ago when Naomi first started developing it. It is something that continues to grow and develop as research comes out, as new ideas come via our teachers, our masters. We're in a continual state of growth as a method, but also as people. And I think now's a good time for questions. I think that's the next slide. And also where to get more information. That's very important. We'll be starting a fundraising campaign on Giving Tuesday, which is November 27th. You can see our video on the website, but also find where courses are being given, and there's tons of free information on our website. So.
Thank you so much, Vicki. And we do have a lot of questions coming in currently in the chat box. One question here is, what is the process to become a validation worker?
Well, there are 2 ways of doing it. We have an internet supported course, which Charles talked a little bit about, and we also have our standard 5-block in-person course. It's I'll talk about the in-person course first. That is 5 times 2 days, spread out over a minimum of 9 months. And why? You study intensely for 2 days with a teacher, and then you go out and practice. And you videotape your work and get feedback from your teacher all along the way. And it takes about 9 months to become a certified validation worker. The internet course is a little bit longer, a little bit more spread out. All the cognitive knowledge is given through films that people can watch whenever they want, very flexibly. And twice a month, there are webinars where everybody in the course gets together, like here. And there's a lot of interaction and deepening of the information. There are only 2 in-person meetings, each one 2 days long, in order to practice skills. And I think that's an important thing that I want to say strongly, and that is validation training cannot only be learned online. It cannot only be learned by watching videos or reading books, because it's a human thing. There's got to be touching. There's got to be feeling the energy of another human being and looking in their eyes, not looking at a screen all the time. And that's why there is almost always an in-person component of every training that we do for certification. Does that answer the question?
I'm pretty sure it does, Vicki. This is Charles. Thank you for that. We have another question, which I think is really important, is that a lot of the members, a lot of people on the webinar today are people that have gained and are maintaining their certification through NCAP, which, as you know, is the National Council. Activity Association. But the point is that they also maintain their certification with that organization. Has validation so far, validation by working with NCAP to help these professionals keep their certification, but also have access to the best type of training when it comes to engaging people living with some form of dementia?
Nice question. There are 2 answers to that. Validation training can enhance any other training, and I encourage that. I think it's very important to have many tools in your toolbox, because the work we do is not easy. And another basic principle is every human being is unique. And so we have to have different tools to work with different kinds of people. What's nice about validation is it becomes sort of a very fertile soil upon which a lot of other methods can be placed. That's sort of the broad answer to that question. VTI and NCAP are now working together to create a special memory care program for activity professionals. And we will be presenting that at the next conference in April. So I'm very excited about that.
Thank you, Vicki. We have a lot of questions coming in right now. The next one is from someone who says, I have a resident who is always wanting to use the phone or leave the facility. She comes in multiple times a day. How do I validate her behavior? And a follow-up to that, can you talk more about body language that can help a resident feel safe, especially if they cannot communicate verbally?
Okay. The first one, of course, I can't give you a recipe, but I can give you some basic ideas on, and goodness gracious, everybody knows a resident who wants to go home or wants to leave the facility. The first thing is to know that person really well. What's their history? What was their work? What makes them feel important? As Charles said, what is their purpose in life? Know that this older person is trying to do that. So if they're saying, I have to go right now, you say, right now? What do you have to do? And then you're engaging them by asking open questions. I'm not promising they're not going to go out the door, but you'll at least start a relationship that can be useful along the line. For the second, body language and people who are nonverbal. A validation practitioner will observe and calibrate whatever the older person is doing. If you're talking about repetitive motion, people who pound on a table or people who make this kind of motion, like they're cleaning. Again, knowing their history is incredibly important because that will give you the clues to get a sense of what is the purpose this person is expressing. Is it that they need to work? Is it that they want to be a good housewife? I don't know. But what we can do is first learn from the history. Second, go into it with them. Observe, calibrate, and explore. I don't know. Does that answer the question?
That is great, Vicki. We have another one that just came in, actually. What advice would you give a student participating in Validation Level 1 course?
Practice centering every day. Breathe. And keep coming back to the basics. Center, observe, and find the empathy. The techniques will come. And don't worry about making mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes. I make mistakes all the time. That's not important. The relationship is what's important. And keep honest.
Vicki, another question here is, how can the validation method be used with an older adult that may not be experiencing dementia, but who is just of old age, and what would that look like?
Well, every human being, in a sense, needs validation. I think the elements I would use with a person who is oriented and very old is I would maintain my integrity. I would use the basic attitude. And I think using open questions, which is one of the verbal techniques, is always very useful. It makes for clearer, more open communication in general.
Thanks, Vicky. This is Charles. We had another question that looked like a comment, but could also be a question, which is that a lot of when it comes to dementia, the older adult, and engagement, we all know that there is more need for scientific evidence. And it's our understanding that validation has some level of evidence. Could you talk a little bit to us about what validation the VTI has done in gaining more evidence, and what are some of the upcoming projects about gaining more evidence to support the work?
Thank you for that question. The very first research that was done on validation is 1967, I believe. A major study that Naomi Feil did and presented at a geriatric conference. Since then, there have been, I would say, 20 scientific research projects done on various aspects of the validation method over the years, and they continue. Today, I just discussed with a young woman who was doing a PhD study on the effects of validation on caregivers as well as family members. I can't wait for that study to be done, and so we can upload it to our website, which is where you can find all the studies that have been done and that we have been sent to us. We upload them and make them available to anybody who wants them. I venture to say that the validation method has been studied longer and more than most other person-centered methods. What we have been trying to do for the last few years, and I have very big hopes for this coming year that we'll finally get the grant to do that, is a major controlled study funded by the NIH and done by professionals and together with a university. That would be the gold standard. And we keep working at it, and that's our goal for 2019.
Thank you, Vicki. Another one here is, when you stated not to tell lies about the reality of the individual, are you just referring to a diagnosis of dementia or late-stage Alzheimer's?
Okay. Dementia is a syndrome. It's not really a diagnosis. It's a bunch of symptoms. And there's a lot of different illnesses or diagnoses that have those symptoms. There's Alzheimer early onset, Alzheimer late onset, there's dementia with Lewy bodies, there's vascular dementia, there's a lot of different kinds. So validation works best with people who have late onset Alzheimer, according to the typical diagnoses. That's not the question, though. Can you give me the question again?
Sure, Vicki. It says, when you stated not to tell lies about the reality of the individual, are you just referring to a diagnosis of dementia or late-stage Alzheimer's?
Okay. Don't lie to anybody with any form of cognitive decline. They hate it. They really do. They know when you're lying. And it will break down the relationship. You can't build trust with the human being when you don't tell them the truth. And confronting a person with something that they can't change. Now we're talking reality orientation. I would say that is probably the hardest for people who have late onset Alzheimer. People who have early onset Alzheimer, it's really dependent on where they are in the process. At the beginning, they know what's going on, and it's very painful. And later on in the process, there's absolutely nothing they can do about it. So it doesn't, confronting them with reality doesn't help them at all. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Vicki. And another one here is, how does someone, if they're interested in the validation method and getting trained, what would be the first step? How do they contact you? And how soon after they start the training and start using it with residents will they see an impact in those residents?
Well, training can be found on our website. You would want to look for the training center that's closest to you or the next upcoming internet supported course that's offered by VTI, and just send us an email to our website. The second part of the question, when do you see results? The minute you start making contact with an older person. I think when you feel the change in yourself, where you're really taking that breath and really looking at the other person and focusing on, wow, what's going on there? That's the change. And the other person will feel that and they will respond to you differently. You can have a conversation. So yes, in some cases, it happens immediately. In other cases, people are really struggling with trying to let go of their stuff, or struggling to learn to enter into the world. That can be. Then it might take a little bit more time.
Vicki, someone else would like to know, can the validation method be used for people who are living with disabilities?
Not really. Not really. The validation method, as like the triangle in its whole, is really specifically for older adults with cognitive decline. Because one of the goals of validation is to help people in that last phase of life to accomplish their purpose, or at least try to resolve unfinished business from the past. And people living with disabilities, they may have unfinished business from the past, but they are not necessarily old and not necessarily in that stage of life where that's what's going on. Does that answer the question? Or are you thinking more of people who, for instance, Down syndrome, older adults? And by older adults with that population, we're talking people in their 60s. What we are seeing is that people who have Down syndrome and get very old and develop symptoms of Alzheimer or some form of dementia, that validation works really well with them.
Vicki, are there any in-person validation trainings offered in California? Someone would like to know.
You know, I'd have to look on the website. I don't know. I hope so. And if not, write and say, give me a course in California. We will try to make it happen.
Well, Vicki, we just want to thank you so much for taking the time today to talk to us about the validation method and for taking time to also answer the questions from folks on the line today. And just as a wrap up, we have a few slides here. Ultimately, at the end of the day, we want everyone to walk away knowing that our job is really to do everything we can to make sure that every resident that we're serving can live life with purpose every day. One thing that Link Senior is doing to help spread that message is our Old People Are Cool campaign. You can find that on Facebook and on Twitter. We share inspiring stories of people who are older and doing what they love and sharing what they love with people all around the world. So we hope to see you on social media sharing your stories as well. We have the contact information today here for Vicki. If you have any follow-up questions that weren't addressed in the chat box today, or you'd like to learn more about how you can get validation training started in your community. And finally, we just want everyone to save the date for our final webinar of 2018. That's going to take place on Tuesday, December 11th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. We will have Jennifer Brush with us, Dementia Care with Montessori for Aging and Dementia Consultant. And we also just want to remind folks that if you have an idea for a 2019 webinar speaker that you'd like to hear from, please let us know so we can get that planned out and ready to go for the 2019 webinar season. And finally, I am putting in the chat box now the link to today's SurveyMonkey evaluation. As I said, please fill this out, even if you're not seeking NAB or NCAP CEU credit, as we'd like to hear what you thought of today's webinar. For those who are seeking credit, please fill out this survey no later than midnight this Sunday, and your certificates will be sent on Monday of next week. If you have any questions or concerns, you can let us know through the survey as well. And we wish you all a great rest of your day and a weekend ahead. Thank you so much, and hope to see you next month. Thank you, Vicki.
Thank you.